resume recording. Okay, it started. So people are okay coming in. Good.
Great.
Glad to see it. Okay. Okay, are you ready?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go.
Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the SMU Tower Center SunStar webinar. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi. I'm the director of the SMU Tower Center SunStar program on Japan and East Asia. This is the last webinar of the SunStar program this semester. We will resume the webinar series next semester in February. Today, I'm delighted to introduce my friend and scholar of the Chinese politics and Japanese politics, Dr. Kristin Vekasi. Dr. Kristin Vekasi has a PhD, received a PhD from University of Wisconsin. And then she is currently teaching at the Political Science Department of University of Maine. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kristin Vekasi. Please join me for welcoming Dr. Vekasi.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is really a delight to be here, and I look forward to sharing my research with you and hearing your questions and the discussion tonight or this morning, as it may be. So the topic that I'm going to talk about tonight is related to, it draws from my book project, which was published recently, but last fall, that has to do with how Japanese companies manage political shocks and political risks when they're doing business in China. This has broadly, so the research really pulls on the 1990s and then really talks about the last 2 decades, stopping in about 2015 or 16. However, there's broadly generalizable lessons that we can learn from this research that are applicable to today. And I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And then also, we're broadly thinking about what does it mean for political relations between countries, especially sort of troubled political relations between countries when you have close business ties. How do the multinationals maybe affect politics? How do the politics affect multinationals? And what are the sorts of the emotions, the understandings, the perceptions, the strategies that are used related to political risks and multinational business? So in the Japan-China relationship, we have this phrase that comes up a lot, seirei keinetsu, cold politics, hot economics. And what this refers to is that while the economic relationship between Japan and China is often very dynamic, there are also these episodes of political shock, of political tension, of political crisis that seem to threaten the diplomatic relationship, but then also maybe threaten the business relationship as well. So this is a photo from 2012, and it shows Chinese protesters standing around a Japanese-Chinese joint venture branded car that's been flipped over and kind of beaten up, and shows the threats, and I'll talk about the political shock in just a second, but some of maybe the threats to Japanese businesses that are attempting to do business in China. Now, typically, it's business as usual. In fact, business thriving in China. So we have, here a photo of a shining assembly line, or a thriving commerce site in Shanghai with Uniqlo. And we see here, right, this is what we want. This is what international business might be. But when international business starts to look like this, what do companies do? Right? How do they manage this? How do they try and navigate their way through these sorts of situations? And what I'll talk about tonight are three sort of broad strategies that multinationals do use. And I'll talk about some of the variation, why they do it, and what the political implications of that are. So one of the first things, right, so the bread and butter of risk management, diversification, exit. They could leave China. So this is generally done through something called the China Plus One strategy. It's usually a total exit, and it's about supply chain diversification. But one of the implications of exit might be loss of market access. So this is not something that firms will do easily or simply. The second thing they might do, and you might see here a sort of an emerging Hirschman exit voice loyalty scheme, is to try and work with their voice, a political or business voice, to transform the situation on the ground. Perhaps to try and lobby for policy changes that make the political situation better, or perhaps even to try and change hearts and minds. And then the third thing they can do is keep their heads down, watch the birds fly by, wait for things to get calmer, right? Just demonstrate loyalty. And I'll show all three of these strategies and how they work, which kinds of firms do which ones, and talk a little bit about the implications of those. So looking over the past 2 decades, there have been 3 really significant political shocks in the Japan-China relationship. First, in 2005, when there was a backlash in China to Japan's bid for a United Nations Security Council seat, and there were protests against it. And there's some other things wrapped up in those protests as well. Second was in 2010, where there was this incident with the Japanese Coast Guard and a fishing trawler in the waters outside this contested territory called Diaoyu in Chinese, or Senkaku in Japanese. And then third, in 2012, around that same contested territory, when Japan nationalized the island, and there was about almost 2 years of extended diplomatic freeze. Now, what you can see, so those are in red, and these sort of negative events. I'm happy to talk about how this was made in the Q&A if people are interested. But what you can see is when there's these spikes, these crises, the black line here shows Japanese exports to China. The gray line, Japanese imports from China. And while there are some mild fluctuations, particularly, right, a sort of a dip of Japanese exports to China in 2012, in general, the economic relationship, the trade relationship, seems to continue on. So here we have our cold politics and our hot economics. Now we know from multiple sources, from surveys, from news reporting to some extent, from JETRO surveys, from JBIC surveys, from Toyo Keizai surveys, that Japanese firms say they're really worried about this stuff. They say, oh, we're concerned, we might have to leave, it really affected our business, and yet we don't see that happening in the macro. So what's going on here, right? How do we understand this cold politics, hot economics, and particularly, how do we try and understand the discrepancies between what companies are doing or saying and what they seem to be doing, at least in the trade relationship? So to answer these questions, what I did in my research was I really went down to the level of the company, and I approached these questions in a lot of different ways with a bunch of different data. And I'll show you a few different things today or tonight. First, I did an analysis of events, like this negative impact against, or sometimes no impact against Japanese companies pulling from newspapers from 2005 to 2013. And I'll actually pull up just sort of the macro results right here, looking at things like when companies said their events were canceled, if they had safety concerns, if they expressed high levels of risk perception, if they had issues like imports or exports, like the sort of famous rare earth case in 2010, they suffered from property damage, boycott movements, if they had to shut their store, their factory due to protests, things like this. But then also there's a big chunk of companies that just said, we haven't had any problems. Right, so we have, I did this event count. I did this with large newspapers as well as small trade publications. I also look at firm and sector level exit and diversification data, something I'll pull up a little bit later. I look at data from corporate social responsibility activities done by Japanese firms in China. Again, I'll pull up on that later. And most importantly, I think, I did about 150 interviews of Japanese and Chinese business actors, ministry officials, and diplomats between 2009 and 2016. And I conducted these interviews in Japan, mostly in the Tokyo area, as well as 5 cities in China, trying to understand what exactly people's experiences were, and how they thought about them, and how it informed their different strategies. So in order to understand the experiences of Japanese companies, right, there are 2 real big, how they experience political risk and political shocks in China. There are 2 main factors that I look at. First is their market orientation, and particularly their relationship with consumer markets. So firms that have, and I'll show you some data, some greater consumer orientation, things like directly selling to consumers, having a dedicated storefront, like that big Uniqlo storefront in Shanghai. If things go south against Japan and China, right, literally a glowing target, right? So a dedicated storefront. Or if you have post-purchase visibility, like a car, right? Something that can take, you bought a Japanese branded object. These sorts of companies are more likely to be directly targeted by popular movements, and perhaps also by the state following political tensions. But a company's experience, an individual's experience with political risk management and with political shocks also tempers the way that they experience political risk. And in particular, what I argue and what I find is that firms that are directly targeted, that have experience with political shock, are actually less likely to be worried about it. They know what to do. They don't end up canceling events. They don't express concerns about safety, and they're able to continue business as usual because they feel calmer. So to look at some of the data, right, how this plays out, we can look, so on this chart, what this shows is as the darker squares show places where more firms have been targeted in after political shocks. And on the x-axis, we have how consumer-oriented the firm is. And then the y-axis shows size and market presence of the firm. So up in the corner here, we have this high consumer orientation and high and large market presence. And we see a lot of firms being targeted there. But then down in the lower corner, we see low consumer orientation and market presence and far fewer firms being targeted. And indeed, I do some statistical analysis and I play this out and find that it is indeed consumer orientation that's really driving whether a firm is targeted after political crises or in political crises or not. On the other hand, the firms that actually express concern are not these ones that are more likely to be targeted, but rather we see that the firms that express concern are the firms that aren't targeted. So we see this disconnect between the experience of being a political target and whether or not you're concerned about it. So what's going on here, right? How can we sort of unpack this? So one of the things that came up a lot in discussions was the idea of physical safety. And in my research, while I heard many rumors, I actually found no actual instances of a Japanese business person or their family actually being physically threatened in China after these political shocks. But many people talked about it. Particularly, we see the problems haven't had any effect on profits or even manufacturing, yet there's something that's not quite right. I never had any personal issues, but I have a sense of unease about the country. Another person says, I'm afraid to speak Japanese in public because it may not be safe, or I might be cheated because I'm Japanese. Now, again, this person never had this experience, but they felt that this was what the experience that they would have, and changed their behavior because of it. Similarly, somebody says, business consultant says in 2010, demonstrations, disputes, strikes, etc. are always stopped by the Chinese government just in time to reassure businessmen that they will be able to conduct their business. If Japanese personnel, or especially their families, felt personally threatened, that threshold would be crossed. Now, as we'll see, this idea of a threshold of safety comes up frequently. Now, how is that threshold not crossed? Well, many Japanese business people who did experience political crisis found that the reassurance came from the Chinese government itself. And I'll show you just a couple of representative quotes. I was really worried when anti-Japanese riots broke out in 2010. I saw on the news windows being broken and a Toyota being overturned in the streets. On my way to the factory during that time, I was stopped by a local policeman. The policeman told me to be careful and to call him if I had any problems. He even gave me his personal phone number. That really gave me a feeling of security. And so this person had managed his feeling of risk. There seems to be a threshold that won't be crossed in order to keep economic exchange between Japan and China flowing. Local governments in China really count on the presence of Japanese firms. Their economy is the major connection. So they have every incentive to keep things under control to the extent that Japanese firms will not leave the area. This means not crossing the threshold of physical violence against Japanese. If that violence had occurred in 2005 or 2012, firms would have pulled out all of their people and, of course, their family members immediately. The officials in China therefore ensured through social control mechanisms that this threshold was not crossed. So this Japanese business consultant felt that this was an intentional move to protect the business interests between Japan and China. So what do they have? They have learned and earned confidence. A retiree from a large general trading company told me in 2011, Japanese firms need to stay in China. The risk always passes. Whether China is a one-party state or a democratic state will not change the fundamental aspects of China that are crucial for economic exchange: location, shared cultural heritage, population, a desire for commerce. As neighbors, it is natural that the two countries will have clashes. Japan and China are relatives, and relatives are bound to bicker. The short-term actions of odd ducks, like former Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, cause some waves in the relationship, but it is important not to look in the short term and events like Yasukuni visits, territorial disputes, demonstrations, etc., but rather at the very broad scope of the relationship. So if we do look at the broad scope of the relationship, right, what are the companies doing? They are worried. Sometimes they do become political targets in these moments of political crisis, which can be very difficult to see coming. How do they manage the risks when they do arise? So the first way that we can think about is exit. And when we think about exit in the Japan-China context, usually this is done in the context of what's called China +1, which again is not typically pulling out of China completely, although I did find instances of firms failing or leaving China for one reason or another, but rather diversifying to another country, typically in Asia. And I'll show you some data. This, however, is not a decision that is made lightly, and I'll pull on a couple of quotes to show you why. With China +1, one person told me, there are two lines of thinking. In terms of accessing China's market and selling there, China +1 would mean expanding within China, and so just opening up new production facilities within the country. This method is good for solving the wage problem, higher wages, but not for hedging against country risk. The meaning of China +1 in my company is now moving to Southeast Asia. In 2012, I saw two Chinas. One was the World Factory. We made things in China and then exported them to another country. The other was the giant market where we sell things we make there. China +1 responds to the first China. If the company's focus is on the second China, then they absolutely cannot leave. So if a firm is exactly that type of consumer-oriented firm that is more at risk in political shocks, China +1 is not the most effective strategy because they're exiting the consumer market as well. So this is not an easy choice that a firm could make. Similarly, we see another quote, you need to look at the country of China from the perspective of Japan. China is so large and so close to Japan that Japanese companies really have no choice but to stay in China. 20 years from now, China will still be there. 30, 50, 100 years from now, China will still be there. Long term, the company must be in China. There is no alternative. This is a question of geography. And indeed, many smaller companies that I talked to and that I analyzed had followed their production network, right, a larger company, to China. That was their one other overseas subsidiary. And they said things to me like, well, if we fail in China, then Tosan, right, then we go bankrupt. That's it. They'd put all of their eggs in the China basket, and exiting China was not really a realistic option. However, we also do see firms that are making the decision to try and leave. And so this is one quote. This is from right after this in 2012, or sorry, this is a quote from 2013, where a member of a large company says, our board members had been vaguely wondering if we should move future production out of China. Then the protests in 2012 prodded us to decide to accelerate planning toward moving out. And so if they do leave, where are companies going? So again, this is largely countries in Southeast Asia. Although India is also one option that is often brought up, particularly, and was particularly encouraged under Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who really tried to build good relationships with India. So looking at, and I look at a lot of different data in my research, but I'm just going to show you some data on new subsidiary creation here. What the data generally show in terms of exit is that after the 2005 and 2010 political crises, firms don't leave. In fact, that's when we really see the cold politics, hot economics phenomena, that you see a political shock and then like new subsidiaries just keep going up, or you see a political shock and then there's more trade. So we really, more sales, more employees hired. I look at a lot of different metrics. But after 2012, you start to see a shift away from China. And I do in the book some statistical analysis that accounts for things like wage changes and some other sort of market mechanisms, and find that particularly for electronics and transportation firms, 2012 marks is a real market shift where firms start to leave first to Southeast Asia and these +1 countries. So we don't see, right? So this is not to say that Japanese firms are leaving China. It's just that there's suddenly a market shift towards new production facilities moving into the +1 countries. So that's our exit strategy. And particularly, again, we find this with electronics and transportation. And again, as we see, right, most firms decide to stay, and most firms want to sell to Chinese consumers. And this is the most sort of sensitive politically part of the Japan-China sort of politics, economics nexus. So here we need to think about how, in the long term, Japanese firms might try and manage the relationship, and maybe even try and improve it. This could be done through lobbying, right, political lobbying, or it could also potentially be done through trying, right, at a sort of a person-to-person level. So thinking about, right, how to work towards change at a lobbying level, right, there's a variety of avenues that companies might choose to take. And one of those is, right, working through business associations such as Keidanren or Keizai Doyukai, or the Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry in China, the characters right there in the middle. And in my research, I found extremely limited evidence that any of this sort of lobbying was happening, somewhat to my surprise. This quote here from former Keidanren chairman Okuda Hiroshi was not in an interview. This was a published quote, but he said in 2005, in response to former Prime Minister Koizumi visiting Yasukuni Shrine, recognizing the need for careful consideration of various issues in and outside the country and for international relations, we understand that the Prime Minister's visit was private, like that of any ordinary citizen. This quote says, this happened, it did negatively impact Japanese business, but we're not going to get involved or make any sort of public comment on it. And indeed, in my interviews and in my research, I found over and over again Japanese business people saying, that happened, we're not involved, we're not going to make any public comment on it. Or in many ways, private comment on it. And one Japanese business official told me, in a somewhat roundabout way himself, Japanese business people have the tendency or inclination to not speak clearly. When I pressed people on this in private conversations, they said the risks were not worth it. The risks of lobbying, particularly on political issues that sure did have an impact on their business relationships, they were worried that the backlash for that lobbying could be even more intense. And I found very limited evidence. That is not to say that Japanese firms didn't use their voice in other ways. And in particular, I found a lot of evidence that Japanese firms were using forms of what we would call public diplomacy if it was done by a government. So it's private diplomacy, right? Public diplomacy done by the private sector, particularly in the form of social contributions to Chinese society or corporate social responsibility activities. So for example, just pulling on a couple of quotes from Japanese business consultants, social contributions to Chinese society were necessary to counter anti-Japanese sentiment. Japanese firms need to become Chinese firms that achieve social responsibility. Social contributions to local society are the most important strategy for firms trying to counter anti-Japanese sentiment because they address the overall problem rather than treating one small symptom. This photo here shows a group of Chinese college students being brought to Japan. This is the first group of students of many that they've done maybe like 15 plus groups now. Saying what close the Japanese companies, right, come close to Japan. And so the Japanese companies following the 2005 protests donate money to start these sorts of exchange programs, start cultural promotion programs, show anime in big exhibitions in China, etc. And what I did in my book, and I'd be happy to talk about the details of this in the Q&A, is looked at contributions that firms made and the experiences that those firms had during anti-Japanese protests. And there's two rounds of donations, one after 2005, another after 2012. And I find in general that the firms that are targeted are the firms that are giving more money. So this is one way, and I learned a lot of corroboration with this with a variety of interview evidence as well, but that this is one way that firms are trying to use their voice to transform Chinese political society and anti-Japanese sentiment. So this sounds like this is a fairly positive story, right? The firms are working to try and promote good relations. But just to end with one sort of note of caution is that sort of the staying in China and doing business does not necessarily translate into feelings of solidarity or friendship. And indeed, I found a lot of cases of loyalty of business without brotherhood. In particular, one thing that came up in interviews a lot was social isolation, ostracism, and depression. One official said to me, I was invited to attend a reception with business people from Jiangxi province before the Senkaku incident. When I went, I moved through the reception and with an empty bubble around me. Occasionally, someone would approach and say hello, but as soon as we exchanged cards, the person would quickly leave. It was embarrassing and lonely. Also, they treated me like a special guest. They invited me as a special guest to this event and then treated me like a pariah. It was incredibly rude. And then perhaps those were fairly common sentiments, and perhaps more concerning was this sort of sentiment for the long-term relationship. Business people always say to me, they hate China and they hate the Chinese. I tell them no one asked them to come or is asking them to stay. I tell them they're there to make a profit. If they do not like it, they can leave. No one is saying China is a great place to be, but it is profitable. So feelings of kindness, of amity, of friendship, of interdependence don't arise automatically, right? This is something that does need to be worked for. So pulling this all together, right? Firms that do wish to integrate and sell in the China market are more vulnerable to political shocks. So the contrast of hot politics, cold politics, hot economics, sometimes it's cold economics too, right? This does affect some firms, and there's a lot of sectoral variation that's really important to pay attention to. And as we move forward thinking about, right, the post-industrial transformation of China, firms that are there working towards that consumer market, when there's another political crisis, they're more vulnerable. So this is something we need to pay attention to. That said, that the experience of these highly globalized, competent multinationals that have a lot of experience with risk management is very stabilizing to the relationship. So they're calmer, they're ready to deal with it. firms actively manage the economic relationship to avoid the pitfalls of the political relationship, but the business connections that they establish do not automatically bridge cultural and political divisions. And that's something, if we think about economic interdependence automatically leading to more amicable political relations, that's the mechanism does not just appear on its own. And it's something that needs to be actively worked for and managed. So thank you so much for your attention thus far. I welcome your questions. Here's my book, if you are interested, as well as my contact information. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Before moving to Q&A, some questions have already been coming in. So if you have any question or comments, please write in the Q&A box, and I will try to pick up the questions as much as possible. Also, before moving to Q&A, I'd like to thank Japan Society Dallas Fort Worth for their partnership and support for the SMU Tower Center. Also, on behalf of the SMU Tower Center, I'd like to thank Japan Airlines for their support for SMU Tower Center and SMU in Japan program at Kansei Gakuin University. So we'd like to start the discussion. I'd like to ask the first question. I have a few questions, but I'll pick up one. One question is, this is actually based on the title of your book, Risk Management Strategies of Japanese Companies in China. For last few years, new risk is added. That's actually the pressure from the United States to decouple from China. But I think decoupling from China is, I would say, suicidal economically for Japanese companies. So I think one risk that Japanese companies have right now on Japanese business in China is how to dodge that pressure. So, what would be your conclusion or argument or advice?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so I'm gonna stop sharing my slides. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a really great question. And I actually think that Japanese companies' experience of managing country risk in China gives them a nimbleness and an ability to think about how to try and manage this U.S.-China economic friction and political friction in ways that I think they're really well equipped to do so. In particular, like thinking about like the China +1 strategy, as Japanese firms have already been thinking about how to internationalize their production networks and supply chains, that potentially gives firms alternatives if the U.S.-China trade war becomes more difficult, or if there are maybe more dramatic like sanctions regimes or difficulties between the United States and China. I absolutely agree with you, as well as my interview respondents also agree with you that Japan decoupling from China is economically and business sense a very terrible idea. And that's not the approach that the Japanese economy or Japanese business community needs to take or is going to take. But on the other but Japan really is in this tough spot between the two countries, and that diversification, that careful diversification that has followed the political shocks is going to continue to serve Japan well. I actually think that's the same case as some of this pandemic era risk management that firms have been able to sort of hedge against. Well, if production we have a production shutdown because of a public health crisis here, how can we manage the supply chain such that we can still have a flow of goods.
Right. Yeah. So I think in your discussion, like an exit and then China +1 are in the same category. But I think that Japanese companies are now choosing between the real exit versus China +1. And to me, it's more the China +1 makes more sense. But
yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And they're most, there's this recent public policy out of Japan to try and encourage Japanese firms to either reshore into Japan or to diversify out of China. And though it's too soon to say whether or not that policy will be ultimately effective, either reshoring or diversifying out of China. My money is on there'll be more diversification and sort of China plus one strategy emerging from that rather than reshoring back to Japan. But we'll see. But that is a change from the period that I'm talking about in my book, when there was not really explicit government support for these diversification efforts. There was implicit support through organizations like JETRO, the Japan External Trade Organization, that held seminars on alternative markets, and here's how you could go to India, and let us try build some new relationships with firms in Thailand, and things like this, and then also trade missions and whatnot. But there wasn't explicit state support saying you should leave China and go somewhere else. And so that is something that has been introduced more recently. And the only real sector that had that was rare earths in the period I'm talking about.
I'd like to pick up one question from my student who is taking Chinese politics class right now. Nielsen Lawrence asks, how has COVID-19 affected the Japanese firms in China? Do you think this will affect the animosity between the two countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of, so initially, like the full global supply chain, right, there was a lot of disruption in production in China, and so that affected Japanese firms like it affected firms from the United States and Australia and around the world, as well as, of course, domestic Chinese firms. And there was a lot of supply chain disruption, and that is gradually coming back, which is good news for the global economy, as well as the Chinese economy. In terms of how it has affected animosity, I mean, I didn't show any of these data in my slides, but there's the public relations and and feelings, mutual feelings of Japanese towards China and Chinese towards Japan are really bad, and anything that happens like this is going to increase distrust and make them worse. And I think very similar to some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the United States vis-a-vis public opinion towards China, and how that has worsened due to the COVID-19 epidemic. We see some of those things in Japan as well, but it was already a very negative place where it was starting. There's a lot of animosity towards China at the popular level in Japan.
Thanks. That's great. I would like to pick up a question from Japanese businessman, Mr. Randy Yoshimura of Sumitomo Shoji, Sumitomo Corporation, head director of the Washington office. Yoshimura-san asks this question. So have you ever compared Japanese business experience with the European or US companies? Sometimes being Japanese in China can have advantages as well as disadvantages. So how would you answer that question?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my book, I don't do a lot of explicit comparison between those two different groups, although I certainly did on a sort of anecdotal level. And I agree that that people did, had those exactly the sentiments that you outline, that there are definitely some shared shared history, shared culture, some shared sort of like norms of communication and doing business that are, I think, really beneficial for Japanese people doing business in China, and there's a lot of regional variation within China as well. So there are some parts of China, particularly in the Northeast, that are really friendly places to be a Japanese company. There's a lot of Chinese people, the young Chinese all study Japanese as their second language. There's a lot of very competent Japanese language speakers. There's a lot of ease in starting a business, for example, in places like Liaoning province and Dalian, places like that, that really do bring a lot of advantages to the Japanese. And then on the other hand, right, there are these times when you do have these political crises that sometimes American or European firms also face the same situations, but the role of anti-foreign sentiment, Japan plays a much more central role in that narrative in Chinese domestic politics. And so when we see anti-foreign sentiment in the case of the United States, or like France, for example, in the 2008 Olympics, it didn't have sort of the staying power, and it didn't have the same sort of mobilizing power that these anti-Japanese incidents have. And so that element of political risk or country risk in China is just much more difficult, I think, for the Japanese to deal with. Now, we also see, to pull one other country in as a comparison, South Korea and South Korean firms in China. And there was a political crisis over in the last 5 years with the THAAD defense system, so the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System that was aimed against North Korean missiles and artillery, that there's a big political backlash against South Korean firms and Chinese tourists to South Korea at that time. And so we do see some of the same sort of political risk dynamics for other countries, but I think Japan has it particularly bad.
Right. Okay. I would like to push a little bit more about the regional variation. So the last week, Ming Ye spoke about Belt and Road Initiative, and one of the active players was actually local governments. I'd like to extend a question that my anthropologist colleague Nico Stearns-Cisterna asked. So here is asking, does it matter where in China these Japanese businesses are located? And does the local geography and regional differences in China between the coast and the interior make a difference? I would say probably yes.
Yes, yes, it does.
So I'd like to also expand this question into how does the relationship of Japanese businesses with local governments matter for their business?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do go into that in the book, and in particular thinking about sort of these ways that, like, this reassurance mechanism, as well as the sort of, like, I guess, the loyalty mechanism. But Japanese companies definitely try and build, right, as all multinational firms do, build closer relationships with local government officials for problem solving, as well as like this country risk management stuff. More typically, it's for day-to-day problem solving. You're having a labor dispute. You're having a wage issue. You just don't understand the permitting process, and you need help with that, right? Like so you want to have allies and understanding within the local government in order to make those things work. And so I do not do a systematic sub-national comparison throughout China on this question. There is a scholar who has done some really interesting work who I'll mention in a minute. But in the interviews, I went to Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenyang, and Dalian. And then, of course, talked to people who had done business in a variety of places throughout China. And in particular, the Northeast and Dalian in particular stand out as a place where there's a extremely functional relationship between the local government and Japanese companies. And so, for example, firms that I talked to who were doing business in Guangzhou said things like, well, I know this person, and this person is my guide. And when I have a problem, I call them, and they help me out, and they help me with my problem solving. And we have good, like Guangxi or whatever, right? We have good relations. In Dalian, people say, I said, well, I'd ask, when you have a problem, who do you go to for help? And they said, well, what sort of problem are you talking about? Like, well, maybe tell me about a recent problem. Like, well, I mean, if I have a labor problem, I go to the labor ministry. If I have this problem, I go to that person. Like it was a very sort of like functional, easy relationship for the firms. And so that they have, Dalian is the place that Japanese firms have really been the longest. They have a very established relationship there. There's a scholar named Casey Miura who's done a lot of work on local governments and anti-foreign protests. And what she has found is that when local governments are more highly dependent on foreign direct investment from a particular country, that affects the way that they sort of manage the protests and they manage social backlash against those companies. So in places where there's more dependence on, say, Japanese investment or Korean investment, she also researches, there's different media coverage, it stops earlier, and the government reaches out to the foreign firms earlier. And so they really are actively trying to keep that investment, then trying to maintain their tax base, trying to have good economic outcomes at the local level. And you can see that play out in the sort of political risk as well.
One question is about the Japanese firm's relationship with Taiwan. And so this is from David Kam, our Power Center member. How much effect is there, if any, for Japanese firms that also have a significant presence in Taiwan during these political shock periods? So so Japanese companies are in also Taiwan, and then does it affect their business in mainland China?
That's a great question. So the answer is it used to matter a lot.
Oh.
And so now the official policy now is that there's a separation between business and politics, but the official policy used to be that there was no separation between business and politics. And what that particularly meant is that if you did business in China, you did not do business in Taiwan. You could pick. And you'd either have your Taiwan business or your China business. And so what the large Japanese companies did is they had a dummy business that was in Taiwan, and then the business with the real name in China, and they did business in both countries anyway. Today, Japanese companies have subsidiaries in Taiwan and China, the large ones that are truly multinational. And in these events of these political crises, their subsidiaries in having a subsidiary in Taiwan does not effectively, increase or decrease their risk. If they are effectively promoting and nurturing their Taiwanese employees that have if they might have good mainland connections or Mandarin language skills, that might help them manage risk on the ground. But actually having that Taiwan connection is not a problem for companies now.
Here's one a little bit crystal ball question from Catherine Ibata Arens, our friend, a colleague, teaching at DePaul University. So she asks, what do you anticipate the San-Japanese politics getting colder or any change under new Prime Minister Abe? New Prime Minister Suga.
She's saying Prime Minister Abe for so many years. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. That's so what I'm worried about right now with the transition to the new Prime Minister is that there'll be, a mistake. And often that nationalist sentiment runs high, and perhaps, Suga doesn't have his cabinet members quite in line the way that Abe might have, or, a particular, right-wing politician might be inclined to seize a platform and make a lot of incendiary statements, and that there isn't good sort of responses to that at the diplomatic level, and that those sorts of things do tend to get to be blown up in Japan-China relations. We're now it was really resolved in 2014. So we're almost 7 years out now from the last major political crisis, which is a pretty good record Right? That's a pretty good stretch. And so my concern is that that maybe something even small will be blown out of proportion. Now, in terms of actual policy, I don't really see Suga taking any turns that would be particularly antagonizing in Japan-China relations. But I'm more worried about these more rhetorical problems that might arise.
And Catherine also asked another question, a little bit also a future problem, but actually near future, soon to be important question. So Chinese pharmaceutics, Sinopharms, they are currently developing COVID-19 vaccines. So if they are successful in developing a vaccine, do they provide it to the Japanese corporate employees in China, despite recent accusations of China-based cyber attacks on Japanese COVID vaccine research? So, well, it's a crystal ball question. So
that is a very crystal ball question.
Yeah.
It's so specific. Yeah, well, I mean, clearly I don't know the answer, but the way that I would probably thread this needle is that as the Chinese government, I would, magnanimously offer the vaccine. And then as the Japanese government, I would talk about individual liberty and say, well, people have the choices that they can make because we're a free society. And then what would they take it? I don't know, but I suspect that's a really fascinating question. I'll have to be following that. Yeah, I mean, the cybersecurity question is really interesting too. That's something that came up a lot in my interviews and concerns about cybersecurity and managing cybersecurity risk. And there was a lot of concern. I haven't followed up on this quite as much over the last few years, but there was a lot of concern even as recently as 2016 that companies were not managing cybersecurity risk as much as they wanted to. Like they felt vulnerable.
I'd like to stretch a question from Jim Holyfield, the director of Tower Center. So he asks a question of how did Trump's withdrawal from TPP and his trade war with China affect Japanese FDI in China? And then I'd like to stretch this question into how would the impact of US-China relations on Japanese business in China be changed, if at all, after under the new administration?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So it's kind of important thinking about TPP and about Japan, the general Japanese strategy over the past 10, 20 years in the region is Japanese companies are increasingly multinational. They have multinational supply chains. They have multinational production networks. Many of those production networks will have localized components. So for example, you'll have like a production network where they make all the different components for some product, like within the same town in China, the same town in Japan. But you have components or like different sorts of supplies, raw materials, et cetera, coming from lots of different places. So in large part, because of these very multinational supply chains, the Japanese government also is aiming for multinational trade agreements. And what they call like high quality agreements. So things that might protect intellectual property rights, things that have shared production standards across borders. So that if you're buying the component from Vietnam or Indonesia or Japan, if it has an ISO number, it will be the same thing. So because it has a shared production standard. So the Japanese government's been pursuing this sort of policy for years. And the TPP was part of that. And when the Obama administration introduces this, Japan, gets on board. It's some pretty high political costs, and then pushes it through. And then after the United States withdraws, continues with that because it's part of the macro strategy, regional economic strategy. And Saudi Katada's book that just came out on Japan's new regional reality is really good and kind of tells this story really well. So I recommend that book to everybody. So when the United States decides to withdraw, I mean that for Japanese businesses, right? That's alarming, because the long-term strategy had been looking at, okay, well, we're going to have this kind of market access, and then this current situation under NAFTA, or at that time at NAFTA, we'll have these different sorts of conditions under this new TPP, and like that was the broad strategy. And then there was a scramble to try and rethink, like how affected are we actually going to be, if the United States isn't in there. And then there was concerns that the U.S. would withdraw from NAFTA, and that was a big panic. And luckily we didn't see that happen. Now we have our USMCA. Right. So throughout all of that, I mean, Japan still can't. China's not part of the TPP. There's still this move towards RCEP, which is getting signed. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Yeah, it's like it's signed today or something, right? It's actually happening.
Yeah, 15th.
Quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And I predicted it would happen at the beginning of the year. I went to DC, and that was my prediction. And then I was like, oh, I guess I was wrong, but it's actually getting signed. So there's and that's not quite as quite the kind of high quality FTA that the TPP was, but it still is this move towards deeper regionalism, and it's sort of incrementally staying the course. So I think the Japanese business community would still like to see the United States re-enter some form of TPP. It would fit in with the broader strategy, political and business strategy, but they're going to incrementally be staying the course, making sure they have high production standards, as Japanese companies do, and building business relationships across multiple borders with complicated supply chains.
So what do you think is the Japanese Japanese companies' expectation of the change that Biden administration may bring?
Yeah. Well, probably some more predictability. In what happens. I think it's a little bit too soon to say what the trade strategy of the Biden administration is going to be, given that the near-term focus will be pandemic and maybe economic stimulus, domestic economic stimulus. I could see a Biden administration maybe trying to get some small concessions from trading partners and re-enter some of the Obama era trade pacts like the TPP. But we have to see what happens over the next year, I think, with the pandemic first.
Well, recently I saw interesting data about so how a public sees China versus how the government sees China. And then the US case is actually basically negative attitude is amplified by politicians. Yep. Japanese case is actually the public opinion about China is actually currently very low, very negative, but government, the politicians do not talk. I think that politicians actually control themselves for not speaking too much about the negative attitude. And then I think that's actually reflects the importance of the business relationship between Japan and China. One question actually I'd like to pick up is coming from our former student Ferus Adams, and he's talking about how have Japanese firms, how are they doing in Africa while Chinese businesses are a lot of presence in Africa. So I'd like to expand a little bit. So how does the relationship between Japanese firms and Chinese firms in foreign countries, like in Africa or other places, how does it affect Japanese business in China? And actually, related to that, one more question. You can answer those questions selectively, but another question is, what's the impact of Belt and Road Initiative? How do Japanese businesses take a BRI? Is it a business opportunity or what?
Yeah. So once again, thinking about those, it's good to sort of think about the broad international regional strategy of Japanese companies, or the Japanese business community, Japanese economy generally. That the maritime Silk Road countries are the same countries that Japan is also building new production networks and has done business in for many decades. And there has been so increasingly over the last decade or two, right, there is more competition between Japanese companies going abroad and Chinese companies going abroad. And the direction that the Japanese government has gone, and that businesses have also gone, is that Japanese investment is high quality investment, and Japanese infrastructure is high quality infrastructure. And there have been a couple of really notable cases, perhaps especially in the high-speed rail case in Indonesia a number of years back, where Japan had sort of had the contract and then lost the contract to a Chinese competitor, a state-owned enterprise. And that was very concerning for the Japanese companies, saying, well, how could we compete against this cheap alternative? And really what you want is this high quality infrastructure and this high quality investment that the Japanese will bring. So there is sort of competition, but probably space for both Japanese and Chinese companies. And of course, Chinese production standards and whatnot are also getting better and better. So it's not that this is not a static situation. And I think this is an area that there's a lot of really interesting, new promising research to do about how Japanese and Chinese companies might be collaborating abroad, and collaborating maybe in infrastructure projects and whatnot that I haven't seen a lot of data on yet, but although I'm excited to see it. But there also has been competition in Africa, as particularly for resources, and that's also something to keep an eye on as we move forward.
Great. Actually, we talked about vaccine, and actually there are a lot of cooperation between Japanese firms and Chinese firms in this area, and then not just vaccine, actually for medicine to cure COVID. And Fujifilm has a huge project with the pharmaceutical company in Zhejiang province. It's very different from in that sense, U.S.-China relations.
No, I think that there's a lot more. There isn't the same sort of pushback in these sectors like pharmaceuticals, or that an American firm with that sort of collaboration, there would, at least at this point, there would be a lot of political pushback against collaboration with Chinese firms. And I think that's perhaps one of the benefits of being a Japanese firm in China right now compared to an American firm. Yeah.
Well, so as we reach 7:30. So this actually is a very important topic, and also timely topic. We can talk about this forever, but well, we kind of reach a positive conclusion. The Japanese business relationship with China is really the basis of the positive bilateral relationship between Japan and China. And then hopefully under the new administration of the United States, US-China relations would also follow the kind of positive cycle of the Japan-China relationship. But under whatever relationship, most important thing is risk management. So this was a very interesting and important topic. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Vekasi. And this is the last SunStar webinar of this semester. And then at the next semester, we will continue webinar series. We are not yet ready to invite speakers to the SMU campus. So we will continue a webinar series. We will resume in February. Have a nice holiday season. It's a little bit early, but have a nice holiday season. And thank you very much for joining us for our webinar series. We adjourn, but please join me for thanking Dr. Vekasi.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, and have a good night or have a nice day.